Um, Good evening, and I would like to welcome you to this evening to tonight's Pozo Senior Sports sponsored event. My name is Beth Parker, and I am the program manager at the Pozo Seniors. Before we get started, I'd like to highlight a couple of the events that that are up and coming, quite exciting and quite active, if you will. Next Tuesday, on October 15th, we are presenting Tales from the Old World with Conceição Andrade at the Pozo Presbyterian Church Sanctuary at 7 o'clock. Please come hear some fairy tales told. Also, on Saturday, October 19th, we have a free Motown dance party at St. Peter's Church, Episcopal Church, from 7 to 9. Come put your boogie shoes on and come dance with us. And if after that, the Motown event, you still want to dance, on October 21st, we have hip hop dancing at 6:30 at Spear Hall. And also that night, we have book club. Lots of things going on. Please check out our events at pozoseniors.org. But let's focus on what's going on tonight. That's why we're all here. Tonight, we are looking forward to a presentation by Ralph Buglas about the history of ferries and the C&O Canal in Montgomery County. Ralph spearheaded a group of researchers and did a great deal of historical research and investigation on the subject in conjunction with the historic Medley District. He gave this presentation and presented a forum in July of this year at the Methodist Church. Ralph is a Montgomery County native who earned a BA in American History from Cornell University and an MA in Journalism from American University, and is a retired communications professional. He is a volunteer in a number of organizations and is a speaker with Montgomery History, an organization through which he has presented previously to the Poolsville Seniors. We want to welcome Ralph for being and thank him for being willing to bring this rich history to us by way of his presentation tonight. Ralph is going to make time to do some questions and answers at the very end. And what we're going to ask you to do is, if you would please hold your questions until the very end, and Ralph can address them. So, Ralph, I give it to you.
All right, thanks very much, Beth, for having me back here to speak at Poolsville Seniors. Yes, this is a presentation that I gave back in July, and as Beth said, there was a whole team of researchers involved in this. I'm not sure that I was spearheading it. It was really a collaborative effort by a lot of people, and I'll give credit as we go along, and especially at the end. Of course, in talking about the Potomac River ferries, we wanted to raise awareness of really a rich history that not just White's Ferry has, but as you see here from the stars that I've shown here, 6 ferries altogether in what at one time was Montgomery County. 2 of those are in now the District of Columbia, but when they were in operation, that was part of Maryland and part of Montgomery County. It's been almost 4 years, can you believe it, that the ferry has been closed over a dispute over landing rights on the Virginia side of the river. And, a lot of people are working to get it open, and this presentation was part of that effort, as I said, to raise awareness. And really what I hope you come away from tonight's talk is that White's Ferry represents a remarkable living history example of, as I said, a rich heritage of the ferries being important in economically, socially, and culturally, and really linking together Western Montgomery County and Northern Virginia. So let's go ahead here. I picked this map from the Civil War because it comes the closest to showing as I said, all 6 of the ferries represented by the 6 stars there that once existed. And now I'll run through the history of each ferry, but to set the stage, perhaps the best way to underscore the ferry's importance is pointing out that there was no Potomac River Bridge anywhere in Montgomery County until well into the 20th century. And yes, you're looking at it, the somewhat infamous American Legion Bridge, which carries the Beltway across the Potomac River, about midway in the county. So for most of the county's history, ferries were the main means of getting across the Potomac, transporting both people and goods, and thus for centuries and through generations, creating important and lasting ties, as I said, economic ties, social ties, cultural linkages. These ferries intricately interlace communities on both sides of the Potomac River, tying together western Montgomery County, you see on the top part of the map, with the greater Leesburg area and Loudoun County, the lower portion of the map. And you can get a sense of all this through this 1854 close-up of northern Loudoun County, also showing western Montgomery County again, and the two main ferries that are shown on this map. It says Conrad's Ferry, it became White's Ferry, and then further downstream, Edwards Ferry, connecting, as I said, Loudoun County with its main locality, Leesburg, with Poolesville, represented by the star in the top portion of the map there, and almost equidistantly by two main roads, appropriately named for the ferries, White's Ferry Road and Edwards Ferry Road. And those, those names of roads continued on the Virginia side. Now, the close connections are also borne out by identical family names on grave markers in both the Union Cemetery in Leesburg and the Monocacy Cemetery in Bellsville. Now, all these names, just a sampling, they're all well-known family names in western Montgomery County. Trundle, Bell, Elgin, Poole. And I'll mention Trundle in particular toward the end of this talk. But the real key here, the ferries were especially significant because of the adjacent C&O Canal as a commercial waterway through DC. And it was in operation for 90 years, open through Montgomery County. Although when the canal was first built, it was something of an obstacle for people and goods just to get across it. But in the main, the canal was a big part of the ferry's importance because of farm products carried by the barges, that is, down to DC. Products like corn, wheat, and oats, much of it grown in Loudoun County and brought by the ferries across the river to be shipped down to DC, along with products, of course, grown in western Montgomery County, in the Poolesville area. So let's quickly run through the 6 ferries, starting at the westernmost edge of Montgomery County with Spinks Ferry. There you see a blow-up of the map. It was shown as Haulings Ferry on this map for an earlier owner. Now, some of these ferries' names varied over time, mostly named for the owners, and it's the owners changed hands. The ferries changed hands sometimes, different owners. Sometimes even the older names holding on even after renaming. Now, Spinks Ferry was just downstream from another ferry underlined at the top of the insert there, Nolan's Ferry. And also just below the C&O Canal Aqueduct that crosses the Monocacy River. Next is Conrad's Ferry, as it's shown here, later and best known as White's Ferry. Now notice the apostrophe. Sometimes there's an apostrophe in these names, sometimes not. I've used the most common versions that you see today. Also notice in that small blow up there, 2 cannons showing strategic importance in the Civil War. And then this dot indicated a warehouse or a granary to store grain. Again, tying into the main theme of this talk, the ferries as vitally important in transporting farm products. And I also want to mention right away that you often hear the name White's Ferry came about when it was bought by Elijah Veers White, a Poolesville native and a big Confederate figure during the Civil War, but not so, as you'll see. Next is Edwards Ferry. It always had that name. Again, notice cannons and a dot for a warehouse on the Virginia side. Then three lesser-known ferries downstream. Pond's Ferry, erroneously labeled Coons Ferry on this blow-up here. It was opposite a now long-gone community called Matildaville in Virginia. And this ferry was about a mile above Great Falls. And then lastly, the two at the bottom there, both gone by the time of this map, but existing when this was part of Montgomery County. The county was formed in 1776, and then this was part of the county until DC was created in 1790. So first at downstream, Aubrey's Ferry, possibly a different name. It's about where Chain Bridge is today. And then the last one, McGee's Ferry, just below where Key Bridge is today. Okay, here's a simplified view of the six of them. The westernmost ones are what I'll call the big three. They were the most important and lasted the longest, and of course, all in the Medley district on the Poolesville area. And here roughly are their years of operation. The dates are hard to pin down in some cases. You see some question marks there. White's Ferry and Edwards Ferry, of those three, really the big two. Although White's Ferry outlasted them all, Edwards Ferry, for much of its life, eclipsed White's Ferry, which may be a bit of a surprise. And then the lower three there, long gone when the big three were thriving. So I'll just mention a few other details about these three. Con's Ferry, just above Conn Island near Great Falls, it ran from the Maryland side to what is now Virginia's River Bend Park, and about where the boat ramp is today in that Virginia park. Not in existence very long, late 1700s into the mid 1800s. Aubrey's Ferry ran to the mouth of a creek in Virginia called Pimmit Run. And there's a sign there today. It notes that this spot was an early industrial area. So it's logical that there would be a ferry there. But in all candor, Francis Aubrey, ferry is probably named for, he was a major colonial landowner in Virginia and had land elsewhere as well, lots of land. And sources differ on whether his ferry was here or much further up. But because of the industrial area over on the Virginia side, very likely there was a ferry in that spot. Operation early 1700s, and certainly it was no longer in operation when the first chain bridge was built. That bridge built 1797, and by that time, that was now part of the District of Columbia. So again, as I said, only one bridge for Montgomery County, and that wasn't until the Beltway opened up, American Legion Bridge. Finally, McGee's Ferry. Here's a very early rough map. It shows its base in Georgetown, just above where Rock Creek empties into the Potomac River, and running above what is now Roosevelt Island. Then it was Mason's Island, owned by, at the time, by the Mason family, who later ran the ferry. So it was sometimes called Mason's Ferry, sometimes McGee's Ferry, or sometimes simply the Georgetown Ferry. Again, starting in the early 1700s, not really sure when it ended operation. But its claim to fame was when the British burned DC and President James Madison had to flee he took this ferry over to Virginia to escape the British. And Madison later returned from Virginia to Maryland, and then famously for us in Montgomery County, spent a night in Brookville, which thus calls itself the nation's capital for a day. When he returned, it was by a different ferry, Conn's Ferry, the one further up near Great Falls. But our main focus here is on the big three up county, lasting far longer and very significant. So let's start with Edwards Ferry, shown at the bottom of this 1865 map, a detail showing the Medley District, western Montgomery County, on this 1865 map. Edwards Ferry, to some extent, the most important of the so-called big three. And notice that this map actually places Edwards Ferry on the Virginia side. In many ways with ferries, the Virginia side is as big a part of the story as the Maryland side. We certainly know that that's true today with White's Ferry and the dispute over landing rights on the Virginia side. Well, Virginia actually began regulating and licensing Potomac River ferries first, way back in the mid-1600s. And at that time, they were viewed as something of a public utility, with their rates being set by the government. And then Maryland got involved later. And when ownership of the river was settled in Maryland's favor, Maryland does own the Potomac River up to the Virginia shoreline based on 1785 compact or charter agreement. So some details about Edwards Ferry. Got its name from its first owner, Benjamin Edwards, and was originally based on the Virginia side, as that map showed. Now, here's an important point. Land on the Maryland side was privately owned, but at that time, landings were considered public use property. That would certainly help us today with White's Ferry's predicament, but that's no longer the case. Private property reigns supreme, you might say. Then a change in ownership, but the name stayed the same. Remember, White's Ferry and Spinks Ferry had different earlier names. Then a bridge built over the canal. Remember, I said that the canal was something of an obstacle when it was first put in. So the building of a bridge over the canal was significant, shows that lots of people and things needed to get across the new canal. But overall, the canal was an economic boost for, of course, shipping farm products from both sides of the river. And emphasizing that, there were warehouses on both sides of the river, as these two maps show, and post offices on both sides of the river, and further indicating significant communities on both sides. This is a composite map, more modern. That is, it shows sites and locations over time, not at any particular time. And so it shows Edwards Ferry Road, I've underlined it there, running in Virginia all the way from Leesburg to Edwards Ferry. Just a portion of that road exists today. And as most of us know, of course, on the Maryland side, there is an Edwards Ferry Road that runs from nearly all the way from Poolesville to and goes all the way to the ferry, starting just outside of Poolesville. Now, most important point, we have records of the canal shipping from newspapers at the time. Here's an Alexandria Gazette report. Alexandria was a destination in addition to Georgetown. Boats, of course, the canal ends in Georgetown, but boats could continue, go out into the Potomac River and continue on to Alexandria, another big port. Now, this particular newspaper item shows two canal barges arriving from Edwards Ferry, as well as one from Spinks Ferry, labeled Monocacy here. These three barges, all in just one day, April 18th, 1845. Now, one of the members of our team of researchers, William Bauman, a really meticulous researcher, he has tracked down these shipments over many years using the Alexandria Gazette here and also using the Evening Star, a longtime DC paper, for arrivals in Georgetown. And speaking of Georgetown, this building still stands in Georgetown right beside the canal. It was once a flour mill and quite large for a flour mill to process all that grain coming down on the nearby canal. Now, remember, I showed a newspaper report of two arrivals from Edwards Ferry in 1845. This is the kind of data that William Bauman, I said, a meticulous research. He has compiled this data for lots of years, but I'm showing just 1845, which was the year of that newspaper clipping. And spreadsheet here, it actually goes on for several slides. I know you can't focus on all the details, but it shows an astounding number of barge trips over the course of that 1 year, 1845, 95 altogether, just from Edwards Ferry. Now, this is a graph showing a 14-year period prior to the Civil War, and there's 1845. 1845 with its 95 barge trips sort of puts it in the middle of the pack, actually. Some years there was more barge trips, some years less. Again, this is all before the Civil War. So this shows what a remarkable shipping hub Edwards Ferry was. And remember, these were boats originating from Edwards Ferry, not just passing through, but starting out from Edwards Ferry with cargo that was loaded aboard there. And this number of trips at this period of time, far more boat trips than from either White's Ferry or Spinks Ferry, but I'll get into that shortly. So that was pre-Civil War. Then comes the Civil War, and the ferries became very strategically important during the Civil War. Potomac River, of course, the dividing line between the North and the South during the Civil War. Union troops were stationed there because of its strategic importance. And then even after the war, it was an important site for the hardening of Confederate soldiers to return south. Now, this is a magazine illustration of Edwards Ferry at the time of the Civil War. Generally speaking, the war curtailed shipping along the canal, and Confederates tried to destroy the canal at various times, but some shipping continued. And from this document that I found in the Leesburg Library, the federal government opened a custom house because farm produce was still crossing the river in this region and then being shipped by canal boat to Georgetown without payment of a duty. You almost get the sense that it was practically viewed as contraband by the federal government. A little known fact and another indication of the ferry's importance. So the ferry is still carrying some cargo during or despite the war, but definitely not as much as before the war because of all the turmoil going on during the war. Okay, now after the Civil War, Elijah Veers White, later of White's Ferry, also became one of the owners of Edwards Ferry. And partly through advertising like this, he made Edwards Ferry even more of a shipping hub than it had been before the war. At the same time, also boosting the other ferry upstream that he's better known for. Now, here's a different kind of graph to highlight the post-Civil War shipping boom. Rather than the number of barge trips, and again, this is with data supplied by William, he put together this graph. It shows the total grain amounts by year. And in a word, Edwards Ferry was bustling. And note 1889 at the far right here. There was a major flood that year, which diminished shipping on the canal and was a harbinger of actually the end of the canal several decades later. But until then, Edwards Ferry was bustling to such an extent that, as you see here, the canal lock there was extended to allow two boats to go through at the same time. That was to speed things up. Also, a large general store was opened right next to the lock. And then the canal closed in another flood, as I said, 1924. Severely damaged the canal, damaged the store. The store and the ferry closed at that time. And so the once thriving community withered away. Here's some photos over time. There on the left, you see the store and a bridge over the ferry again, because importance of getting people across. Granary. Here's another photo. Better look at the store there in the background, the lockkeeper's house, and a barge in the lock there. Here's what was left of the store in the still in the early 1970s, no longer running as a store. Then it crumbled. At one point, just the foundation remained, but the Park Service has partially rebuilt it as a reminder of the community that once existed there. All right, let's go ahead a little bit in time here. Here's an article from the Evening Star in the early 20th century. And it notes that a new ferry boat is now carrying a newfangled invention. The automobile can accommodate 3 automobiles, but also confirming that Edwards Ferry, that point being famous for its large trans-river business, as well as a shipping point on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. Accompanying that article, a not so great photo, but maybe you can make out on the far right, ferryman and an early car on the ferry boat. Almost impossible to make out, but the ferryman is using a pole to move the ferry. Motorized ferries didn't come along until later. And while I've been stressing farm products being moved across the river and then onto the canal, it was also people coming across the ferry to take passenger boats, what are called packet boats here. And they could take those boats either direction on the canal. But you'd never know that all this was going on at Edwards Ferry from the serene setting that it is today. Now, on the Virginia side, an important connection to Black history comes from this article of the C&O Canal Association newsletter. Basil Newman, also operating a pre-Civil War ferry as a free Black man. He owned a warehouse and a ferry boat. And in that boat, he may have used that boat to help escaping enslaved people, as noted on this cemetery marker. Also depicted on this mural that's in nearby Leesburg. And a unique feature just downstream from Edwards Ferry was the Goose Creek River Lock. This is a different kind of lock. It would let boats into the C&O Canal after crossing the Potomac River from Virginia and from another canal along Goose Creek over on the Virginia side there. So boats in the Goose Creek Canal head out into the Potomac River, cross, and then enter the C&O Canal by the Goose Creek River Lock there, adding to all the business at White's Ferry. The Goose Creek River Lock is just a little stream today, you see here, really belying what a bustling hub Edwards Ferry was at one time. And for most of the time, even more so than White's Ferry. So let's move on now to what was first Conrad's Ferry, but as I said, best known as White's Ferry. Got the name Conrad's Ferry when it was for its first owner's first name, a bit unusual, though a later owner, interestingly, had the last name Conrad. And again, when the canal opened, the ferry owner argued, as you see here, the value of the ferry would be destroyed unless a facility for crossing the canal was provided. So a culvert was built under the canal to get, in this case, to get across the canal, in this case, under the canal. Now, I showed a graph like this earlier for Edwards Ferry. This is that same 14-year period of shipping data pre-Civil War. And note the most number of barge trips starting out from here in 1845. That was the year I highlighted for Edwards Ferry. Only 11 here at White's Ferry in that year, compared to that whopping 95 barge trips starting out from Edwards Ferry. So you really get a sense here. Edwards Ferry, a whole different order of magnitude at that time before the Civil War. But White's Ferry would boom after the Civil War. I want to highlight one other year here, 1849, and again, bring in shipping data that William Bauman compiled for that year to show that the shipping by barges was two-way. That is the far right column there. It shows products that boats would bring back from D.C., including to two spots in Virginia, Goose Creek and Leesburg, carried over there by the ferries. And this was the case not only here at White's Ferry, but the other ferries as well. The barges taking grain into D.C. and then bringing products back to this area. And as at Edwards Ferry, it was people also being transported by White's Ferry to, again, connect with the canal and then board packet boats. It was about this time, before the Civil War, that ancestors of Elijah White, earlier members of the well-known Poolesville White family, they ran the ferry at that time, and that's when it began to be called White's Ferry, well before its later ownership by Elijah White. Elijah White living in Loudoun County at that time. And that little nugget about White's Ferry really getting the name before it was owned by Elijah White, it's thanks to John Walls and Jim Poole, both of whom may be on the call tonight. Now, like at Edwards Ferry, the Civil War, very important. As you can see, Union forces built a blockhouse there to guard the ferry. And again, a custom house was established there. Then after the Civil War, this is when White's Ferry really boomed, in large part due to Elijah White's ownership now. Same time he owned Edwards Ferry also. And there were warehouses and or granaries on both sides of the river, like at Edwards Ferry. Similarly, a post office for the now bustling site. How much shipping was going on? Well, this graph is similar to the post-Civil War shipping boom graph that I showed for Edwards Ferry. This one shows White's Ferry was now pretty much on par with Edwards in terms of the amount of grain being shipped down the canal. Its peak years being roughly the mid-1870s to the mid-1880s, with the highest number of barge trips in any single year, 42. That's compared to, as we saw, a pre-Civil War high of just 11 in one year. So this is when White's Ferry came into its own as a significant shipping hub. Now, the time beyond this graph, the late 1800s, early 1900s, were also peak years for the canal in terms of carrying coal coming from further west in Maryland. But one unfortunate incident at White's Ferry underscores the importance of coal. And in fact, a ferryman was killed carrying coal on his ferry boat, take it over to the Virginia side from the canal. So besides farm products, ferrying coal was also important. The next ferry owner, his son, started ferrying cars, which brings us to the all-important transition of White's Ferry to carrying motor vehicles. All the more important after Edwards Ferry had closed and the canal closed all together. So some details about this transition to ferrying motor vehicles. You saw the first ferry boat would have only 3 cars. Then after World War II, a different ferry boat and different owners. That's when the Brown family took possession of the ferry, and several generations of the Brown family operated it well into the 21st century, through the whole second half of the 20th century. Then larger barges, and now the ferry boats motorized, and ferry size increasing all the time. As I said, the Brown family ran the ferry until it was closed in December 2020. That's why I say we're coming up on the 4-year anniversary mark now. Closed over landing rights in Virginia. It was acquired by new owners in 2021, and they recently offered to donate the ferry to Montgomery County to try to get it reopened. And checked just today, apparently no movement in that regard. Maybe someone can fill us in at the end of the talk if something is going on now. Some photos of White's Ferry over time. That's that building in the background there. That's the granary close to the canal. And then way over behind it on the far right of the photograph, a warehouse, both very large. And a later bridge across the canal. Instead of using that culvert that I showed earlier, this bridge partially survives. The warehouse and granary still stood into the mid-1960s, but deteriorating, and now only the foundations of both buildings remain. Was indeed a Boy Scout project that cleared away a lot of the underbrush here so that they could be visible again. Photos of White's Ferry's evolution carrying cars. And there you see the General Jewel Early. It was Elijah White who named an earlier ferry boat for his Confederate commander, Jubal Early, who had indeed crossed the Potomac River nearby at White's Ford during the Civil War. And then that name of the ferry boat, General Jubal Early, stuck, though with a middle initial added for a larger boat that came along. And until the most recent boat was renamed Historic White's Ferry. Okay, the last ferry, Spinks Ferry, first named Clapham's Ferry. It faced early competition from Nolan's Ferry just upstream. There you see Nolan's Ferry, and then Spinks Ferry a little downstream on the Potomac, about 2.5 miles. And Nolan's was also a big shipping hub over time, reinforcing this story about Montgomery County's ferry, but it was in Frederick County, so just mentioning it here. And one other tidbit, it was Thomas Jefferson who crossed at Nolan's Ferry, on his way to Philadelphia for the Declaration of Independence. But back to Spinks Ferry, as we saw earlier, originally called Hollings Ferry for an earlier owner. Before the canal opened, it was an important link between Virginia and Baltimore. And then about the time that the canal opened, became known for the rest of its life by its new owner, John Spinks. Like elsewhere, a bridge was built, a store, post office, and granary. But ultimately, this one closed before the other two, White's Ferry and Edwards Ferry. Still, for a while, busier than White's Ferry. And to see that, here's a graph of barge trips per year, pre-Civil War again, boats starting out from Spinks Ferry, compared to the same data that I showed for White's Ferry. Now remember, the third one, Edwards Ferry, much busier in this period. The Y vertical axis there went much higher on the graph. Remember, there were 95 boat trips in 1845 at Edwards Ferry. So, indeed, in this period of time, Edwards Ferry, the biggest of the big three. Also remember, these are trips by boats originating from Spinks Ferry. So let's focus just on 1851, the highest number of boats. Bring in the shipping data for that year that William Bauman put together. And here, the two main boats, the Rambler and the Maryland, originating from Spinks Ferry here, well, they were owned by local farmers. And there you see the name Trundle again, the name I showed in the cemetery slide about connections on both sides of the river. Reinforcing that, Ezekiel Trunda, owner of the Maryland boat, was the brother-in-law of the ferry owner, John Spinks. Only a few reminders of Spinks Ferry exists today. Ruins of the granary, road leading to the ferry from Monocacy Aqueduct, and then on the right there, the ferry landing on the Virginia side. Still evident today. And a unique indication of its significance at one time, again, Spinks Ferry Road on the Virginia side leads to this star here, a large house built by the Spinks family in the ferry's prosperous days. Still being used today, but very differently, a wedding venue. And here it is on this composite map, which shows a Spinks Ferry Road on the Maryland side. Not there today. What's there today is the power plant on the western edge of Montgomery County. So summing up, the 6 ferries for centuries, the only way to get across the Potomac River, closely tying together western Montgomery County and Loudoun County and its county seat, now the city of Leesburg, in a host of ways. And then with the canal coming along in tandem with the canal, the 2 ferries lasting the longest, White's and Edwards, very significant for shipping farm products, and thus, of course, boosting the area's economy. Even after the canal closed, White's Ferry had successfully transitioned, carrying motor vehicles, maintaining the ties formed over generations since colonial days. And so there's a rich heritage, with White's Ferry being, might say, a living history example of all this, or living history up till its recent closing. And so it's revival. Important to keep this heritage and tradition with us. And among the so-called big three, I've said Edwards was the busiest in many ways. But here's another way of looking at it. In terms of where the canal boatmen were based, that is, where they lived. Remember, all that shipping data that I showed was from the point of origin in each case, Edwards Ferry, White's Ferry, or Spinks Ferry. And in this regard, where the boatmen were based or where they lived, all 3 of the ferries quite similar over time. And to underscore the other side of the river, Loudoun County, equally important in terms of where the boatmen lived or based. Leesburg and Goose Creek on the Virginia side. And in underscoring this on the Virginia side, these owners and or namesakes of the 3 big ferries actually lived on the Virginia side at various times. Now, two final points, one having to do with slavery. At the July Forum, we had a panel discussion, and there was quite a bit of discussion about slavery related to this topic. This is, again, the 1860 Martinet and Bond map of Montgomery County, showing just the Medley District, western Montgomery County. And I've underlined, using census data, all the slave owners. And I know it's hard to make out, but it really is a visual representation that 50% of the landowners approximately 50% of the landowners in the Medley District held enslaved people in 1860, right on the onset of the Civil War. Now, that's in comparison to 32% countywide. 10 years earlier, countywide, slavery was more prevalent countywide. So that you see that it was dropping in the 10 years before the Civil War countywide. But again, in the Medley District, slavery was actually increasing at that time. And so, as I said, quite a bit of discussion about the extent to which the ferries and the canal, that all the farm business, had to do with farms where enslaved people were used. And I give a number of talks around the county, and Kenny Scholes has given a number of talks here for Poolesville seniors too. And he makes the point, I make the point too, that slavery generally more prevalent than is thought today. And this shows that. One last indication of the ferry's significance in terms of land value. This newspaper item announcing the auction of, as it says, valuable tract of land very close to the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. What makes this so valuable? Well, as you can see, let me get this out of the way there. It's the only possible place for a ferry between Georgetown and Edwards Ferry. So presumably a moneymaker. Now there's some hints to where this potential ferry spot was. 10 miles above Georgetown, the river not more than 75 yards wide at that point. Well, I've tried to track that spot, and as far as I can tell, never a ferry there, but perhaps this spot was just a little beyond the American Legion Bridge, which is where we began this talk. Yes, the dreaded American Legion Bridge. And I think this photo's a great way to show how good it would be to have the ferry alternative up county restored. As I said, this was a whole team effort. This slide doesn't begin to acknowledge the tremendous research assistance provided by William Bauman, John Wall, Jim Poole, and Link Howing did much to pull us all together. And then historical documents written by the last three and other sources as well to tell this story of the importance of the Potomac River ferries over time and still today. If only we can get it reopened. Okay, I'll take questions, but I did first want to mention that if you're a local history buff, the Montgomery County annual Montgomery County History Conference, sponsored by Montgomery History, is coming up in just a little over a week. Saturday, October 19th, full-day conference be held at Montgomery College, the Rockville campus. And there you see, you can register, find out more information at the website for Montgomery History, the county's historical society, montgomeryhistory.org. Okay, I'll stop share and open it up to questions or maybe elaborations if anyone knows anything further about the current state of possibly reopening the ferry.
I think the ferry reopening is still pretty stagnant from what I've heard from the Fair Access Committee. So it doesn't seem like there's a lot of movement.
Yes, I wasn't able to find anything, but I thought maybe I confess I'm not a Poolesville resident, so I'm not as
No,
close
right.
as most of you.
Yeah, the
And
Fair Access Committee addresses it at their meetings every month, but so far there isn't a lot of information forthcoming. So
I'm delighted to see that John Walls and Jim Poole are here. If they want to add anything else, always welcome your additions.
Hi, Ralph. I'm curious if the later part of when the canal was running, how many dairy products were running from the three upper canal areas to down to Georgetown? Is there any?
That's um, I would have to look at William Bauman's detailed charts for each year because he did separate out the products. Um, I think there were some dairy products, but by and large, it wasn't as much of a factor as the grain that was shipped down, wheat and corn and so on. Dairy products really, and dairy farms really came into their own toward the end of the 1800s. That's when the railroad came through Montgomery County. And so that was the train could get dairy products into DC a lot more quickly. And so there wasn't the worry about spoilage of dairy products. John did just note in the chat that Lock 26 was known as the Milk Lock. So yes, there were dairy products, but not as significant. And another thing that I remember during our research, Spinks Ferry in particular, the drop off of there, we surmised was really because of the Dickerson stop on the train station near, that would have been the nearest one. And so that's probably with the railroad coming in, taking away shipping from Spinks Ferry.
Yeah, I know there was a farmer by the last name of Black who had a huge dairy farm near Dickerson, or in
Mm-hmm.
Dickerson actually, and he had a processing plant in Washington D.C. So I was just trying to link those two together.
Do you know the dates of that farm?
It was early 1900s.
Yeah, okay. Most likely the products were being shipped by rail at that time.
makes sense. Well, I appreciate getting the clarification on the name of White's Ferry. I had no idea. I always attribute it to Elijah White as the naming person who named it. I thought that was fascinating to learn that was a Chiswell White who actually named the ferry. So I appreciate that tidbit of information. Thank you.
Yes, and it's hard though to I'm sure that you're still going to hear that a lot
Oh yeah,
because
you
it's
will.
it's hard to
It's
bat
ingrained in
down
the
these things.
folklore.
But as I said, thanks to John Walls for that and so much more.
Right,
Both
absolutely.
John, Jim, and William, really, they provided all the details for this talk. I often say I'm mostly the storyteller for it.
Yeah, well, this was very great. This was terrific. I enjoyed this very much.
I enjoyed putting it together. It was
Yeah.
it's history not well enough known, so important to get it out there.
And a good storyteller you are, Ralph.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
thank you, Beth.
We really enjoyed this. I have learned a whole lot in going through both of these, and I thank you for agreeing to do this again, coming and showing all of your information. And I'm so appreciative to everyone who actually did all of this research, because it obviously takes some digging. to get this information together. There's a lot of
Oh.
history.
Oh, absolutely. Hats off to William Bauman for all the
Yeah,
digging that he did on
Okay.
as I indicated, it's spreadsheet after spreadsheet.
Okay.
Amazing. But I'm delighted to support Poolsville seniors in this way. The programs you put on are fabulous. I've tuned into a number of them, and happy to come back anytime.
that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We appreciate it. And if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and wrap everything up. And again, thank you. And I hope this can have some effect in the proceedings of our efforts in opening the ferry.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Thank you so much. Have a good night,
Thanks, everyone.
everyone.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye.